Good morning. The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Committee on Science and Technology meets to consider the following measures. H.R. 5866, the Nuclear Energy Research and Development Act of 2010, and H.R. 6160, the Rare Earths and Critical Materials Revitalization Act of 2010. Also, I want to welcome our interns today. I think we have a lot of interns here. Welcome to see how sausage is made. I think you'll be pleased that we're doing it in a good way. We will now proceed with the markup. Today, we will consider two important pieces of legislation that will help America recapture a technological lead in a wide range of industries critical to our economy, our national defense, and the clean and secure energy future. First, we will consider H.R. 5866, co-sponsored by myself, Subcommittee Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Hall, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Inglis. This bill amends the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to modernize and improve our federal nuclear energy R&D programs. Our nation's 104 commercial reactors today produce 20% of our electricity and 70% of our emission-free energy. If we are to increase our energy independence and mitigate the effects of climate change, nuclear must continue to be a part of our nation's energy mix. However, capital costs continue to rise for construction of new plants, and the question of how to manage the waste byproducts of nuclear fission remains. H.R. 5866 provides the programmatic architecture needed at DOE to answer and solve these outstanding issues. This bill is the result of a truly bipartisan effort over the past 6 months, and I would like to thank Mr. Hall, Mr. Inglis, Dr. Baird, as well as the committee staff of both the majority and the minority for their continued good work as we move this legislation through the committee and to the floor. The second bill on the roster is H.R. 6160, introduced by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dalkemper, and co-sponsored by Mr. Carnahan, Mr. Jerry Lewis, and Mr. Kaufman and myself. As the I&O subcommittee hearing in March highlighted, and Ms. Dalkemper understands well, rare earths are an essential component of the technologies in a wide range of emerging and established industries. For everything from oil refining to hybrid cars, wind turbines to weapon systems, and the demand for rare earths is only expected to grow. However, despite the fact that the U.S. at one time was the global leader in this field, we are now 95% dependent on China for rare earths. Making matters more urgent, China has begun limiting production and the export of rare earths and required that products using using rare earth be manufactured in China and largely for Chinese consumption. And for the ones of you that have not had a chance to see the paper this morning, I wanted you to see the front page of the New York Times business section. The headline is, "Despite China, in dispute, China blocks rare earths exports to Japan." Now, let me just suggest that I suspect in the next few days that Congress is going to take action on some concerns about the Chinese currency. And with that action, we could well see next week that the headline could be, "In dispute, China blocks rare earth mineral exports to the United States." That would be devastating to our economy as well as to our national security. This is clearly an untenable position for the U.S. I believe it would be foolish to stake our national defense and economic security on China's goodwill or hope that it will choose to compete in a fair and open global marketplace for rare earths. The stakes are simply too high. This is not the first time the committee has been concerned with competitive implications of materials such as rare earths. In 1980, 30 years ago, this committee established a national minerals and materials policy. One core element in the legislation was the call to support for a vigorous and comprehensive and coordinated program for materials research and development. Unfortunately, over successive administrations, the effort to sustain the program fell apart. Now it's time to revise a coordinated effort to level the global playing field in rare earth. Ms. Dalkemper's bill calls for increased research and development to help address the nation's rare earth shortage and reinvigorates the national policy for critical materials. With that, I thank you for your attendance and participation this morning and look forward to a productive markup. And I now recognize Mr. Hall to present his opening statement.
For holding the markup of H.R. 5866, our nuclear research bill, and 2010, the Rare Earths and Critical Materials Revitalization Act. And as this is expected to be maybe our last markup of the 111th Congress, and at my age, I don't ever like to say this is our last vote or this is our last day up here, this is my last day in Congress or anything, but I want to take the opportunity to really thank you personally for your service to the committee and your very fair and bipartisan approach to working with us and the members of the committee over the years. We all feel that way, and we certainly wish you well. The first bill we'll consider authorizes the nuclear energy R&D programs of the Department of Energy. And we're all aware of the importance of nuclear energy to America's future. It provides a safe, reliable, and cost-competitive source of energy to meet future increases in electricity demand. And it's not battled by a lot of the goofy people that are opposed to a lot of the other types of energy that we have. It's safe, and we should have been, other than having about 20%, we ought to have somewhere closer to 50% nuclear outgo. Didn't happen, and there's a lot of other things that we could look back for and repeat the words from that famous poem, Maud Muller. The last sentence of it said, "Of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest of these it might have been." And if we'd have worked harder on nuclear and supported it more and looked more toward the proper energy thrust to the future, I think we'd be better off. In the short term, we need to license and build more reactors using existing light water technology, but over the longer term, we need to advance the development and licensing of new reactor designs, extend the life of the existing reactor fleet, and address the serious issue of managing waste and spent nuclear fuel. That's a big order. The continued research and development is necessary to overcome all of these challenges, and this bill will help us to get through a comprehensive approach that authorizes existing R&D activities at DOE with an emphasis on accelerating the advancement and eventual licensing of small modular reactors. It's a good bill. I thank the majority for working with us throughout the summer to craft it, and I'm pleased to join Chairman Gordon, Energy Subcommittee Chairman Baird, and Ranking Member Inglis as a co-sponsor. I know that the second bill we'll consider creates a, quote, rare earths mineral, unquote, R&D program at DOE and authorizes DOE to make loan guarantees for mining, processing, and industrial production of rare earth minerals. This is an important issue that warrants our attention. Rare earths are used in many different high-tech applications, including certain military and weapons systems, and China controls the bulk of world supply and recently announced its intention to reduce exports, triggering concerns that the U.S. could face a supply gap. The obvious question we face is how best to address this concern with respect to potential national security ramifications. I understand that the Department of Defense will soon complete a study regarding its need for a domestic rare earth supply capability, a question that appropriately will be addressed by DOD and the Armed Services Committee. With respect to commercial supply needs, it appears that increased demand and actions by China have resulted in sharp price increases for rare earth materials. This in turn has stimulated an immediate market response as companies around the world are aggressively pursuing new rare earth mining and processing opportunities. A suggestion that a taxpayer subsidy for such activity may not be necessary. The important questions remain unanswered because we bypassed regular order with this legislation, and members have had only a brief opportunity to consider this issue in legislation. I'm uncomfortable supporting passage of this bill. I'm not positive as to how I feel about the bill, but I'm very understanding that we have a problem that we probably need to settle for ourselves without selecting one single entity to support, that we get some competitive approach to it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Pardon, if I might retract that, if I have any time left, I want to yield it to Mr. Bilberry.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate the ranking member yielding. Look, I just want to, regardless of the details of how we work this out, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for raising these two issues, because I think too often here in Washington and around this country, we talk about lofty ideas, things like clean air, clean, affordable energy. We talk about electrification of automobiles and more efficient use of what energy we have. These two items you've brought up are those essential things that are put on back burners and are not bothered with because they may be politically hot, but they are the foundations that are essential to lay if you're ever going to see things like clean, affordable energy, if you're going to see electrification of our fleets, and especially these two, is the fact that the nuclear power issue is one that has been a political third rail, but you're brave enough to address it, and I congratulate and thank you for the American people on that. And the issue of rare earth is one of those detailed things that are essential. If you think about this as the permanent magnet, high-efficiency electric motors that are driving Prius and our troop carriers are essential for this. So if you believe in a clean, electrified fleet, then you've got to be brave enough to stand up on rare earth. If you believe in a clean air and want to address climate change, then you've got to be brave enough to stand up for next-generation nuclear. And I appreciate the fact that, Mr. Chairman, that you've been brave enough to be able to do that. And I hope that the committee over at E&C and in Interior are brave enough to stand up and talk frankly about this, because we're not going to see those great opportunities for the future if the committees and this Congress aren't brave enough to do what you're doing today. And I want to yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I too appreciate your interest in involving the committee in this very, very important issue. And I'll continue to work with you on the issue as we move forward. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, over here. Could I ask unanimous consent to it?
I think Mr. Hall yields to the lady from Illinois.
And I would ask unanimous consent to include in the record my opening statement on H.R. 5866.
Everybody's statement.
Mr. Chairman?
Let me first say that everyone's statement will be included in the record at this time, and Dr. Bartlett is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to request a colloquy to address concerns about Section 8 raised by Constellation Energy, which serves many constituents in my district. That same concern is expressed by a number of other utilities.
Dr. Bartlett, why don't we wait till we start the bill, and then I'll be happy to have a colloquy with you. If that,
oh, thank you.
Just to try to keep in proper order here. We will now consider H.R. 5866, the Nuclear Energy Research Development Act of 2010. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to describe the bill. As I noted before, the bill before you is a product of a bipartisan collaboration aimed at pursuing nuclear power technologies that address concerns over waste, as well as to reduce the cost of building new reactors. It enjoys the support of many utilities, vendors, customers, and trade associations, including General Electric, Westinghouse, Babcock & Wilcox, NuScale, the American Chemical Society, the Next Generation of Nuclear Plant Industry Alliance, and the Nuclear Energy Institute. Among the initiatives authorized under the bill is a small modular reactor program that will provide the necessary funding to research, develop, and demonstrate SMR technologies that could bridge the gap that now exists between the nuclear industry and the private investment community. This legislation will also promote the development of a well-rounded and pragmatic approach to our nation's nuclear waste. As the country continues to debate the waste strategy, it has become clear that the new technological solutions can exist if given the proper support and resources to develop. The Fuel Cycle R&D initiative in this bill provides the necessary direction and resources to support cutting-edge research in this critical area. Furthermore, in addition to looking at advanced technologies, H.R. 5866 recognizes the important role our current fleet must play in addressing our emissions-free energy needs for years to come. To that end, we authorize a program that will explore new ways to extend the life of reactors already supplying us electricity today. I appreciate the ranking member and his staff's work on this bill, and I look forward to working with him as we move forward. I now recognize Mr. Hall to present any remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Just to reiterate from my opening remarks, this is a good bill. It was crafted in a bipartisan fashion that included extensive interaction with nuclear energy stakeholders, and I think that's important. I know members on our side are going to be offering some amendments, some important amendments to improve the bill further, particularly with respect to how we address nuclear waste storage and the future of Yucca Mountain. This is a very important topic, and I look forward to a good debate, discussion on it, and I thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Dr. Bartlett is recognized.
Thank you. Constellation Energy came to us with a concern, and when I read Section 8, I have the same concern. It says, not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary shall transmit to the Congress a report summarizing quantitative risks associated with the potential of a severe accident arising from the use of civilian nuclear energy technology, including reactor technology deployed or likely to be deployed as of the date of enactment of this act. This gives the impression that we don't now have that. And it gives the impression the industry feels that, the production of nuclear electricity may not be safe. And I would appreciate a colloquy to address this.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. I would like to, again, I appreciate you sharing your concerns with the committee. And I want to thank you for bringing this concern to the committee's attention. As I have said before, I am supportive of nuclear power, as I believe it is a part of the solution to the challenges of energy independence and climate change. The gentleman is correct that our 104 commercial reactors have run with strong records of safety and operating efficiency. I share your concern that Section 8 might be misinterpreted. In light of the fact that these concerns have been brought forward only recently, I concur with your assessment that the report language would be the most appropriate way to address them, and I'm confident that the staff from both sides will work together as they have throughout this process and address these concerns as we move forward to the floor.
We have more than 50-year great track record of completely safe and economic production of nuclear energy, and it's unfortunate that we might give the impression that somehow it's not safe because we're going to require all of these regulations. Thank you for committing to address this in report language.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Governor Garamendi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This report is going to be very important. For example, California has a law that prohibits new nuclear power plants unless they are safe, and because of the safety issue. So a report about the safety of the existing and future plants could open the door for the development of nuclear power in California. Without such a report from the national level, it's less likely that that hurdle would be overcome. So I think the report's going to be useful. Exactly how it's going to be written in the tone and tenor, I'll leave that to the chairman to work out.
Thank you, Governor. I don't think anybody on this committee, certainly you are much more aware of the issue than I am, and we look forward for your continuing stewardship. This is not just one bill and out. This committee needs to continue to have oversight as this goes forward. So thank you. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? If not, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the chair. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 051, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. In addition to making clarifying and conforming changes, my manager's amendment incorporates a number of our members' concerns and has been worked out in advance with Mr. Hall through this amendment. Mr. Lujan ensures that a range of geologic media are considered for storage options in the alternative and deep borehole storage methods subsection. Mr. Lujan also ensures that the factors to be considered in the project selection criteria are independent of the administration's provisions, and we ensure that small modular reactors are defined as having a high degree of fabrication and modularity. We ensure that the Power Marketing Administration, such as TVA, may use revenues generated through electricity sales toward the non-federal cost share in the small modular reactor program. And I appreciate the time Mr. Lujan, Mr. Hall have put into making this a better bill through the manager's amendment, and I urge its adoption. Is there further discussion on the manager's amendment? Mr. Hall is recognized.
Thank you. Of course, this bill was crafted in bipartisan fashion. These changes improve the underlying legislation. We urge its passage. Yield back.
If there's no further discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbrey. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 056, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Bilbrey of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple and straightforward. It asks the DOE to conduct a report examining state requirements, including moratoriums that delay development of nuclear power in ways that the United States government can assist in overcoming these barriers. Currently, there are dozens of states that have moratoriums from building new nuclear plants. As our nation grapples with the increased energy demands and the environmental concerns about traditional carbon-emitting problems, the increase in nuclear is one that is a national concern. Many individuals and groups, from the president of Stanford University and has addressed this issue and raised concerns about these kind of obstructions. I'd just like to say that California has 4 nuclear reactors that furnish about 13% of the state's electricity, saving over $2.6 billion per year in natural gas, and actually 22 metric tons of greenhouse gases are avoided. Just by adding 4 more modern reactors, we would allow the electric sector to reduce greenhouse emissions by 40%. Now, Mr. Chairman of the committee, you've got to understand that traditionally our clean air strategies were based on air basin impacts, which were local or state impacts. Now that we're talking about the climate change issue, it is now not just state by state, it is national and global. And when we start having one state following regulations, there's interstate and global impacts on that. And just a good example is my own state, which prides itself at being environmentally sensitive, has obstructed the construction of any new zero-emission generating reactors when, in fact, it has gone out of the state and purchased coal-fired plants instead, which to me, really, as somebody who's worked on clean air, is an embarrassment for a state that has been traditional leader. All I'm asking is we take a look at this, we get the facts, and I think it's essential, especially under the latest climate change issues and the interstate commerce issue, that the federal government look at the obstructions that are being created by states that will block the implementation of our clean air strategies and this energy independence concept. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbrey. We will recommend that this amendment be accepted. I would like to say to you that we have some concerns about jurisdiction that might be raised, and so I would like to work with you as we go to the floor if we need to tweak that for those purposes. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The third amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, who is not here at this time. And so is Mr. Tonko going to do it, or we want to take unanimous consent? Okay, so we will, without objection, we will take that up at a later time. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 037, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5866 currently focuses solely on the reactor side of nuclear power generation. However, the steam side presents numerous opportunities to make improvements that could increase turbine and generator efficiency, leading to higher power outputs for the same steam flow. I believe that it is important to address efficiency improvements on the steam side as well as the reactor side. This amendment would allow that to happen. Adoption of this amendment would make H.R. 5866 a comprehensive approach to improving nuclear power plant efficiency. Improvements in efficiency lead to higher electricity output. For every 1% improvement in efficiency, the available energy is increased by 2.5%. Not only will these improvements help improve efficiency, but the new technologies that this amendment will help develop will result in creating jobs and technology expertise. Some of the areas that would be addressed by my amendment include cooling systems, heat exchangers and pumps, special coatings, and advanced power conversion systems. Better cooling systems and heat exchangers would enable heat to be transferred from the reactor side to the steam side more efficiently. Better pumps would allow for lower losses of energy in circulating water and steam from the reactor side to the steam side and vice versa. Special coatings would improve the lifetime of components by making them more resistant to erosion. Coatings could also aid in the rate of heat transfer, leading to better heat exchanger performance. Finally, advanced power conversion systems would help convert mechanical energy from the steam turbine into electrical energy more efficiently, providing more electricity for the same steam flow. In summary, my amendment would make H.R. 5866 a comprehensive approach to improving nuclear power plant efficiency. I ask, therefore, my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko, for that good amendment. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Comrade Robacher.
All right. Mr. Commissar, what can I say? I don't think we need to oppose this amendment, but I think that we need just a little clarification of what we're really talking about here. And I think what we're talking about with this amendment is tweaking old technology. And the whole idea of light water reactors and steam, this is stuff that's been around for 60 years, and it is not something that's going to break new ground at all. Now, it may well be worthwhile to find out if there are ways to tweak old technology. I mean, sometimes it's more cost-effective to upgrade your old car rather than buy a new car that's based on an entirely new approach to providing the energy for your car. So I would suggest, however, and let me ask to make sure this is clear, this amendment authorizes so that the funds can be used for this, but doesn't mandate that they have to be used.
Exactly.
And there's no reason for us not to keep that within the range of considerations by the Department of Energy to see if that is indeed a worthwhile investment to find new ways of using basically light water reactors and using the steam from them. However, which we will hear later on in the amendments that are being offered today, there are new ways of producing nuclear energy that don't require steam that are much more, if we're actually going to cement ourselves into doing something in the future, it should be based on new technology like these small modular reactors, the gas-cooled reactors, et cetera, the reactors that will eat the waste from other reactors rather than the old process that left a lot of problems after the energy was actually generated. So I just wanted to make sure that in the record we are this amendment is just permitting the Department of Energy to do this rather than mandating it.
Mr. Tonko is recognized.
I concur. The language is enabling. It's not mandatory. And to your point, or to use your language, if they see that the existing efficiency opportunities can be tweaked to a greater degree,
right,
let's do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Mr. Hall is recognized.
Chairman, I hadn't talked with Mr. Rohrbacher on this, but I think he feels if it is permissive that he has no real problem. And I probably am not in shape to speak for the entire this side of the committee, but it seemed like the amendment simply authorizes DOE to pursue research on them to improve cooling and steam generation efficiencies of nuclear plants. And while the primary focus of and funding for DOE nuclear R&D activities ought to continue to be on reactor design and operations, it seems to me that the steam side is also an important area of interest that DOE should consider pursuing. And I had planned to support the amendment, and I yield back.
I think everyone is. To the best I can understand, if there's no further discussion, Then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The fifth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman, if you can read it.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 032, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California and Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This section deals with the necessity of how to handle nuclear fuels, not only in their initial, but in their secondary and perhaps third, fourth, or fifth stage. It talks about recycling, what to do with the spent fuels. The general thrust of the total section is that the Secretary may consider. I'd much prefer that would be the Secretary shall, but when I was over at the Department of Interior, I always wanted to have the flexibility. Now that I'm here, I think that's not so necessary. Nevertheless, even with that, this particular amendment goes to one part of this, which is the full recycling program, and provides somewhat more clear direction to the Secretary about what full recycling is, and specifically making it clear that we're talking about Generation 4 reactors. These are reactors that could ultimately significantly reduce the amount of nuclear waste by perhaps 90% by recycling repeatedly through Generation 4 reactors, and in so doing dramatically reduce the toxicity and the decay heat. And that's what the amendment does. Ms. Biggert has joined me on this amendment, and I'm sure, and I yield to her.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate being on this amendment. I think this is a very, very important concept. And when we think about the reactors now, when we're really taking probably 6% of the nuclear energy and using that, and then throwing away really 94% of the nuclear energy, and whether we're going to have to store it or whatever, well, if we have these fast reactors, that we really can conserve that. You know, nuclear is not a substance that is without a limit, and so the more that we can protect that, because I think the only way that we're really going to solve our problems with energy is to have long-term nuclear energy, and the fast reactors are the way to go, and the recycling of that. So I appreciate the gentleman allowing me to co-sponsor it, and would ask for support.
I will wrap up on this amendment. The Generation 4 reactors, often called integral fast reactors, are available. They've been around for some 30 or 40 years. They do work. We've never proceeded with them because I think because of a mistake that's been made over the years, that these reactors could lead to proliferation of nuclear materials. In fact, there's a methodology called pyroprocessing that dramatically reduces the potential for proliferation. And so when joined, the pyroprocessing, which this amendment would encourage, but not only specify, together with the integral fast reactors, could dramatically reduce the nuclear waste, increase the potential power of the nuclear fuels, and dramatically reduce the proliferation concerns. That's the direction this amendment pushes us. And as I said, if I had my choice, I'd make this entire section the Secretary shall do, but we're not there yet. I'll continue to push for that. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
And thank you for a very good amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Robacher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We are, let's just, I want to make sure that we are defining what we're doing here, and this does permit, again, this focus on Generation 4 reactors. I am not certain whether or not that designation includes some of the other type of innovations that are taking place in the nuclear energy and the development field. So whereas there's not this contradiction because it just says they may, but it doesn't mean that they are not also going to be looking at the other ways of achieving the goals of this amendment. So, and I'd like to ask my colleague whether or not that's the case.
This particular section goes to one kind of reactor, the Generation 4. The other three preceding sections really specifically deal with the alternative systems, partial recycling, once through, and the other, including modulars. So they're all included throughout the legislation. This one speaks to one portion or one kind. The other sections speak to the other types of reactors and the other systems of recycling.
So we're not limiting the other sections by this section and by your amendment. Let me
That's correct.
Let me note that in the past, the biggest arguments against nuclear energy have been that there is of course, there's a safety problem, people worrying about meltdowns, et cetera. There have been worries about the leftover material and the storage of that, of which we've heard over and over again in very passionate debate in the Congress on those issues. Well, there are now technological solutions to those challenges, and we have now, with newer technologies, whether it's the high-temperature gas-cooled reactor or pebble-based reactors, and we now have a way to prevent a project, a nuclear energy project, from becoming something that gives us more problems with nuclear proliferation. And we now have a way of minimizing the storage of spent fuel with the whole Yucca Mountain issue. So I would just suggest that, and I support the amendment, but I just want to make sure for the record that there are many other ways rather than just specifically outlining one if Generation 4 means one system, there's another broad area that we should be looking at. Yep. And this is not exclusive as we're putting it into the law. I yield back.
Your concerns are addressed by the totality of the bill. The chairman has written a bill that's very broad, covers virtually every kind of technology, recycling technology, and
right,
as well as the various kinds of reactors, with the exception, even fusion is involved in this, I think, in some small way. So he has written a very comprehensive bill. Your concerns are fully addressed by the totality of the bill.
And not changed by this amendment.
Well, the amendment provides more direction with regard to this specific type of reactor,
right,
but does not preclude any of the other research and development that is called for in other sections of the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The sixth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Inglis. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 029, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment basically makes it so that the Secretary would have to submit a report to us, to the Congress, comparing anything that comes out of the Blue Ribbon Commission to the Yucca Mountain alternative. So when we marked up this bill at subcommittee, I offered an amendment encouraging the administration to reconsider their decision on Yucca Mountain. I withdrew the amendment over concerns that, as written, it wasn't germane. But with the great help of Katie Crooks and the minority staff, we've gotten language now that is germane. So in 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to address the long-term management of nuclear waste. The Department of Energy was charged with collecting, transporting, storing, and disposing of the nation's spent nuclear fuel. In 1987, Congress concluded that DOE would take title to waste and store it at Yucca Mountain in a permanent geological repository. Over the past 27 years, the nuclear industry and nuclear electricity ratepayers have contributed $17 billion to the Nuclear Waste Fund. Of that $17 billion, South Carolinians have contributed $1.2 billion. Ratepayers and nuclear power generators contributed to the Waste Fund in anticipation that the Department of Energy would begin accepting and storing spent fuel waste starting in 1998. Now it's 12 years later, and South Carolina continues to store 4,000 metric tons of waste in places that are not long-term storage. It's no surprise that this delay is costly. The government has breached its contract with the nuclear industry, exposing taxpayers to expensive lawsuits. Millions of Americans continue to house nuclear waste in their communities, assuming undue risk. The delay is also discouraging investment in nuclear power, slowing down the resurgence of this very exciting industry, a new way of making, or a way of making power for our future. What we need is a clear and achievable plan for dealing with waste. Despite a long history of clear bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress for long-term storage of spent fuel at Yucca Mountain, this administration has decided to reopen the question. President Obama proposes to use the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future to find an alternative solution to managing nuclear waste. This panel may well come up with some innovations in managing the nuclear waste stockpile, but the repeatedly expressed will of the U.S. Congress is long-term geologic storage at Yucca Mountain. While some may disagree that geologic storage at Yucca is the best option, we cannot disagree on these facts, that the nation has invested a lot of time and resources in Yucca Mountain, 23 years, $10 billion. So the amendment I offer today directs the Department of Energy to compare the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission to Yucca Mountain. If we abandon the solution, we should first have full accounting of what we are sacrificing in terms of safety, security, cost, technological expertise, and site readiness. So the concept, again, is simply to take the Blue Ribbon Commission report and order them to compare any options they come up with to the Yucca Mountain option. And that seems to make sense because we've invested now these 23 years or so, 23 years and $17 billion in Yucca. So any alternatives should be compared to the investment we've already made, and then we can decide whether we go forward with Yucca or we go forward with one of these other options. But let's not just overlook the fact that it's 27 years and $17 billion, Mr. Chairman. So I hope we'll have support for this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis, and thank you for working to craft the amendment in such a way that we feel more comfortable that we don't have a joint jurisdiction problem. If there is a claim made anywhere, we may have to work a little bit more, but I know you've worked in good faith to do that. And your good work has already resulted in several boxes of information coming to the committee. So more importantly, thank you for your work on this bill and your stewardship as ranking member of the Energy Committee. I hope you will find this is one more highlight in what you've been able to get accomplished.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to comment in a general way on this proposed amendment and also the Sensenbrenner amendment and give a physicist's perception on this. I think the original legislation that was passed by the Congress some years ago was deficient, and perhaps because it went through a committee other than the Science Committee, and I think that continues to be a problem. The constant use of the term disposal, I think, is a mistake. We are not disposing of the material. We are storing it. And using the word disposal implies that somehow we're getting rid of it, and it's not going to exist anymore. Now, we might possibly do that by blasting it out and sending it to the sun, which would probably be a pretty good job of disintegrating much of it. But it really fools us into thinking that, well, if we can just put it in the ground at Yucca Mountain, then everything will be wonderful. And that's why Yucca Mountain, I believe, has had so much trouble. I think the only way to do it is to realize we are storing it, we're not disposing of it, and that we turn to monitored retrievable storage, which should satisfy the critics who say that Yucca Mountain is not safe because 10,000 years from now we'll still have all that radioactivity there. if we have monitored retrievable storage funded by the same source of funds that Mr. Inglis referred to, you can have a much more viable system where you store it in canisters, which are examined regularly. If one should leak, then they are transported out by robots, and the leak is fixed, and they're put back in. It'd be a very low-cost maintenance effort, and I think it would be far safer than anything that we've heard discussed before. Now, it's a little extreme to try to bring that concept in here at this point, and we'd probably seriously have jurisdictional problems. But I think the waste and the lack of good direction that Mr. Inglis referred to is something that has to be addressed by the Congress. And if the other committee, which claims jurisdiction, is not willing to work with us on this, I think then we have to fight hard to see that our method would prevail. And I'm not going to say that the only method would be monitored retrievable storage, but at least let's recognize that we're just storing it there, and it's not going to be gone. And if you're worried about leakage, then you should have a method of observing it, which is where the monitored part comes in, because simply putting it underground doesn't mean that it's safe. It doesn't mean that it's being held properly. There's no way to examine it and see whether or not it's leaking or whether other problems are developing. So I just want to offer that at this point. And one of my regrets about leaving the Congress at the end of this session is that this is one problem that I felt should be addressed, and I've never been able to persuade enough people. They're all afraid of addressing this problem because of the political ramifications. I think there are ways to doing it that are politically more acceptable. So I'd appreciate comments of Mr. Inglis and others on this suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. Governor
Chairman?
Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman?
Well, I think we need to go to this side of the aisle
Okay.
right now. Governor Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ingles and Mr. Ehlers are on a track that's really important. I would add one more thing to it in a couple of comments. Is it waste or is it a valuable asset? Ms. Biggards earlier said that about 6% or less of the current energy in the nuclear fuel is actually consumed, leaving a significant potential energy source which has heretofore been considered to be a waste. When that waste is consumed in a Generation 4 reactor, perhaps first in a Generation 3 reactor and then on into a Generation 4 reactor, you then turn that 96% waste into an extraordinary asset that could provide energy for many, many years, perhaps several hundred years. So we need to look at this in a different way, and in order to get to that new way of looking at it, you have to have some sort of reactor and reprocessing system that can actually consume that material, which I would now call an asset. And that's where this Generation 4 comes into play. Coupled with Generation 3, you can then move forward. And the storage systems then become, as Dr. Ehlers said, a temporary, retrievable storage system because you want to get to the asset. That's what this is all about. The chairman is quite correct in the direction of the bill and pushing us off in that direction. So I thank the chairman and for the discussion.
Will the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I want to thank you for your comment because that fits in with my comment. We are not disposing of it. We're simply storing it. And there are ways we can use it. You've mentioned one way. There are other ways we can extract additional energy out of the so-called waste. And you're quite right. Instead of talking about disposal, we should talk about storage. Instead of talking about waste, let's talk about resources. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Couldn't go through a bill without hearing from Dr. Brown. I was wondering where you were.
I'm not a sleeper.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Dr. Bartlett had asked to be recognized first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, for the leading technology country in the world, it's very sad that we are not leading the technology in nuclear power development. Our so-called waste is, of course, as was adequately shown to us in the Codel you led to France. We went through the big Areva facility there. Is a feedstock for reactors that end up with a fraction of the waste that we have in volume, and with a very much shorter half-life. You have to store them securely for far lesser years. I hope that this storage is retrievable, because darn well need to be retrieving it in the future to burn it in these new reactors. I don't know why we're so far behind, but golly, we've got to catch up here. The rest of the world is leading the charge, and we're behind. And, thank you for this bill, which encourages us to catch up. Thank you.
Dr. Brown is recognized for five minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I assure you I'm not asleep over here. And I have tremendous interest in this discussion. I wanted to add my 2 cents. We have a tremendous facility at Savannah River Site in South Carolina where we have a lab that will very happily research of how to expand our nuclear energy potential as a nation, help us to determine alternative uses of these resources that have in the past been called waste. And I agree with Dr. Ehlers and Mr. Garamendi that these are resources that need to be utilized, and I highly recommend that we expand the utilization of the lab at Savannah River Site and others around this country to look into how we can utilize this material, because it is extremely important. It's extremely valuable. It's not just a resource to dump in the ground and just leave there. So it is a reusable resource, and we need to do everything we can in this committee as well as in Congress and as well as in the government overall to try to expand these types of research and development projects. And I highly encourage us to keep our eye on the ability to do that. And I appreciate Mr. Garamendi's amendment, and I highly recommend that this committee continue to focus upon those resources and how we can expand the use. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. A major thrust of this whole bill is really to get into research so that we can deal with proliferation issues, that we can deal with storage issues, and as Dr. Bartlett says, make us a world leader again. Is there further discussion? Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is an important amendment. It highlights a fundamental priority for a lot of us in ensuring the long-term viability of nuclear power itself. Completing the review and license application of the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository. We simply can't have a revival of nuclear energy in this country if we don't find a way to safely dispose of it. Or maybe, I think the doctor didn't like the word dispose of. Maybe we could use getting rid of, or divorcing, or maybe funeralize it. And at Yucca Mountain, we'd have a sign that here lies nuclear waste, where the rest of us can rest in peace. And maybe as the governor set out, and I gleaned this from his suggestions, that we might one day want to go back into that. That it might be useful to future generations for things that we don't know. And the governor's brought his coffee back. I'll say that again for him. Thank you, Governor, for your statements, because I think you're indicating that there may be someday a future use for that. And for the professor down here and the more sophisticated grammarians here, it might tell you that we may want to visit the nuclear cemetery over there at Yucca Mountain. And in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, it said, "Man once buried, once dug up again." Maybe we could do that here. At any rate, I just want to say that, unfortunately, the Obama administration turned its back on Yucca Mountain, and just like they ran a line through Constellation and put NASA to flight, they completely have taken it off the table. This amendment simply says that DOE shouldn't consider alternatives to Yucca in a vacuum, and I think that's what our chairman is saying. They ought to be directly compared on a scientific and technical basis to see which solutions are the best. This is a good amendment. I urge its passage, and I thank Mr. English for offering it, for his leadership in this issue, and the chairman for being as open with us and giving us the opportunity to say some of the silly things some of us want to say.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I think this well-discussed amendment now is ready for a vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The seventh amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Wu. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? I am, Mr. Chairman. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 058, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Wu of Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The American people justifiably want to see the most made of our existing resources before spending additional taxpayer dollars on equipment and facilities. I am therefore offering a straightforward, good government amendment to create a database of federally funded research facilities capable of supporting unclassified nuclear energy research. My amendment further directs the Secretary of Energy to make this database available on the Department's website so that researchers can easily locate available research facilities across the United States. I hope that this database would also allow universities to make their facilities more widely available to outside researchers who may benefit from state-of-the-art resources already maintained at institutions nationwide. I also believe that in creating a more centrally organized network of research facilities will benefit researchers and universities alike while ensuring that taxpayers receive maximum return on their investment in federally funded facilities. The inspiration for this amendment came from one of the major research universities in my home state of Oregon. Oregon State University currently maintains a small research reactor for use in civilian nuclear research. Innovation is crucial to maintaining U.S. leadership in the 21st century global economy. Ideas and idea-driven industries hold the key to developing the technology that will make our nation's energy independence possible, and I believe the Department of Energy can play an important role in helping to make future innovations in nuclear energy safe, clean, and affordable. Toward this end, we all have a responsibility to do what we can to facilitate a U.S. research community that is competitive, collaborative, and consumer-oriented. At the same time, we must ensure that we are doing everything we can to maximize the use of our prior investments in nuclear R&D facilities. And therefore, I think it's crucial that we help make our nation's world-class research resources more easily accessible to the university research community. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wu, for this good amendment. Is there further discussion? If no further discussion, then the amendment. Oh, Mr. Hall?
I'll just turn my light off.
Okay. Then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The eighth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner. He's not here, so Mr. Hall is going to offer that in his behalf. Are you ready to proceed with the amendment?
I have an amendment to desk, Mr. Sensenbrenner does.
I hope I don't have to, but I reserve a point of order on the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 044, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment highlights further the need to address the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. It clarifies that DOE will be responsible to disposal of the high-level radioactive waste or spent fuel generated by the reactors developed through R&D programs in the bill. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act requires DOE to dispose of high-level radioactive waste from commercial reactors by January 31st, 1998. In 1987, Congress amended the NPWA to specify a national nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain. The high-level radioactive waste produced by the small modular reactors and next-generation nuclear plants authorized by this bill would fit the definition of high-level radioactive waste in the NWPA. And the purpose of this amendment is to reinforce or maybe to message congressional intent that DOE license and construct Yucca Mountain. In spite of the law, President Obama and Secretary Chu have attempting to permanently shutter Yucca Mountain. An administrative board of judges at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission called Secretary Chu's rationale to shutter Yucca Mountain illogical, quote, contrary and not persuasive, quote, insignificant, and cites the NPWA's detailed congressional record to repudiate DOE. I support the amendment, and I think yeah, and I understand your point of order is developed toward the Section 12 there, and we have an offer there to strike the word develop, if that would help.
Without objection, the amendment will be altered. The amendment will strike the word developed. And just for clarification, Mr. Hall, what this will mean is that the only disposal responsibility to the Department of Energy will be that within its those programs that it is putting forth.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, when you take development out, it still says under the programs authorized in this act,
This
or
act,
the
yeah.
amendments made by this act. It's inclusive to this act.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered for the in terms of the altering of the amendment. Mr. Hall, let me say quickly on this amendment that I have long put forth my opinion that Yucca should go forward. I am opposed to closing it. I was not opposed to this amendment, other than the fact that we need to be sure that it was germane to this bill. Also, on a higher level, I want to be. This is a very important bill for our country, as we've said on a number of occasions, and so I think we want to be sure that we do it in the right way, and there's no reason to do something that would jeopardize the completion of the bill. So, with no, Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, on the basis of comments made earlier, I'm bothered that this talks about both disposal and radioactive waste. And I hate to hold up the bill or this amendment, since I don't have a real disagreement with the amendment, but I would hope that you would be willing to join me in a manager's amendment that would clarify it along the lines that Mr. Garamendi and Dr. Bartlett and I have indicated, and also Dr. Brown, so that when it reaches the floor, it'll make more sense than it does right now.
I have always found the gentleman reasonable, and certainly, Dr. Ehlers, that we will continue to work on this. We want to get it right.
Yeah, thank you.
If there's Governor Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I understand where Mr. Sensenbrenner wants to go here. This bill is an extremely important one, as you just said, for a variety of reasons. This new section is going to become a lightning rod with some, and may very well cause opposition that we would not otherwise have. And I would be cautious here, because the intent of the amendment, as was suggested, is to deal with Yucca Mountain. I don't think we need to do that again. It's already there, the discussion and debate. I don't know all the politics, haven't been around here long enough, but I can be pretty certain that the folks in Nevada don't want to have one more poke in the eye about Yucca Mountain, and might very well raise significant objections to the bill itself as a result of this amendment, which I think is unnecessary.
Thank you.
Would gentlemen yield?
Of course.
I respectfully, to Your Excellency, suggest that there's no change to current law here. And you are right that it's very, very important. The chairman's right. It's one of the most important bills that we'll view. And I thank you for your input.
Thank you. I think that we have concurrence here, that we have been cautious, that we have an amendment now that is both in virtue of politically and in germaneness is appropriate. And so I think we're through with this discussion. Okay, I withdraw my reservation. If there's no further discussion, then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. 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 Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. And now we return to an amendment by Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 076, amendment to H.R. 5866, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon. I'm very appreciative of the work that you, Chairman Baird, and ranking members Hall and Inglis have put into developing this important bipartisan legislation, as Mr. Hall was just emphasizing how truly important this bill is. I'd especially like to thank the chairman for his leadership with respect to small modular reactors. My amendment is short, and I'll keep my remarks similarly brief. Like many of you, I'm concerned the United States no longer manufactures the vessels and equipment needed to build conventional nuclear reactors. I'm concerned that Westinghouse is no longer an American company. It is now part of Toshiba, and that Japan Steel Works has a monopoly on manufacturing steel containment vessels. I'm excited about this bill because it will position us to take the lead on SMRs. We have the capability to manufacture everything needed for these reactors, and U.S. companies are far ahead of their competitors. My amendment would require that applicants who want to participate in the Department of Energy's SMR program explain how their proposal will increase domestic manufacturing activity, exports, and employment. I think this provision will help translate our investments in SMRs into jobs, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski, for a good amendment. Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion, the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. The ayes appear to have it. Excuse me. Are there noes? Hearing no noes, the ayes once again have it, and the amendment is passed. The vote now occurs on the bill, H.R. 5688, as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I now recognize Mr. Hall for an amendment, or for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5866 as amended to the House with recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. I yield back my time.
The question on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. Thank you. We passed a good bill there. We now will consider H.R. 6160, the Rare Earth Critical Materials Revitalization Act of 2010. I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dowkemper, for 5 minutes to describe the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking today in support of my bipartisan bill, the Rare Earth and Critical Materials Revitalization Act. And if many of you are like me, you probably didn't know a lot about rare earth materials until recently. During a subcommittee hearing in this room, when I did learn about them, I realized that we must do something to address a growing gap between the United States and China in the use and development of these materials. Rare earth materials are used in defense, industrial uses, energy, optics, and electronics. These materials go into our iPods, speakers, disk drives, batteries for electric cars, products that are all being currently manufactured in China because we can't make them here. China currently accounts for between 90 and 97% of the world's supply of rare earth materials. General Electric in my district can use these materials to make wind turbines, helping to give us greater energy independence. The National Association of Manufacturers has endorsed this bill because of the importance of these materials to American manufacturing. These materials don't though, just go into electronics and clean energy products, but they are also used in all sorts of critical military-based technologies, like precision-guided weapons and night vision goggles. So we're not just talking about our energy security here today, but we're also talking about our national security. Just this summer, China announced that it would cut its exports for the second half of 2010 by 72%. At the same time, China has stated clearly that foreign firms who move their manufacturing capacity onto Chinese soil will have no trouble procuring rare earth materials. Today, we have an opportunity to begin the long process of catching up with the Chinese and beginning to make these goods in America again. We simply cannot depend on China or any other country for such crucial material to our national security. If China decides to stop selling those goods to us, we need to have our own supply available. I'm thankful to the chairman for the opportunity to bring this bill up, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dahlkemper. I now recognize Mr. Hall to present any remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief and just reemphasize from my earlier statement, ensuring a stable, a very stable supply of rare earth minerals is very important to our high-tech economy, and as has just been said, and our national security. And this issue certainly warrants our close review. However, it's not clear whether the bill before us would completely address the problem effectively, and they really haven't had a chance to do that. There are a lot of unresolved questions, and the fact that we didn't have time to undertake a full committee or subcommittee hearing is not blamed on anybody on this legislation. The subcommittee markup through which to consider these questions is regrettable. I think we really need it. But I look forward to the debate and discussion. I yield back.
Is there anyone else who wishes to be recognized on the bill? If not, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dahlkemper. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment, Ms. Dahlkemper?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 051, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mrs. Dahlkemper of Pennsylvania.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's 3 parts to the manager's amendment. The first item removes the word technical from Section 101C2C, which requires the Secretary of Energy to include in the program plan a description of the factors to be used when evaluating applications for loan guarantees. Use of the phrase technical criteria could be read to say that the DOE would predetermine very specific design requirements in project applications, something the government is not necessarily well qualified to do. Removing technical leaves the intent of the subparagraph intact and the discretion to the Secretary as to how detailed the criteria may be. In the second part, we're making our language on the types of projects eligible for loan guarantees consistent with the other loan guarantee authorizations in Title 17 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. With the amendment, the Secretary must evaluate loan guarantee applications against technologies in place at the time the application is being considered, so that the funds go only to projects making significant advances in technology. This change was recommended by my colleagues across the aisle, and I'm happy to include it here. And the last section, I would like to, at this point, yield to my friend from Ohio, Mr. Wilson, to explain that portion.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Gordon and Congresswoman Dahlkemper. Thank you for addressing a concern of mine in this manager's amendment, by including the word accessibility in Section 201. An article in today's New York Times highlights the fragile supply chain of rare earth materials. In response to Japan's detainment of a fishing captain, China has halted all exports of rare earth elements to Japan. American firms rely heavily on both Japan and China to supply the magnets and other materials needed for hybrid cars and systems vital to our national defense. If Japan no longer has access to rare earth minerals from China, America would be entirely reliant on China for materials necessary to our country's security. I'm pretty sure that this is a situation we don't want to get into. Even before this latest incident, export quotas, embargoes, and policies limiting supplies only to firms willing to establish their manufacturing operations nearby leave open the possibility that there might be a large source of rare earth materials unavailable to firms in the United States. Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Dahlkemper, thank you for ensuring that this accessibility issue remains as an important component in the future assessments of rare earth materials. Thank you.
I want to thank the gentleman for his contribution to this amendment. Very much needed, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, are you ready to proceed?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 321, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Olson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I guess we'll be going to recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The goal of my amendment is to provide us with the flexibility going forward to the benefit of the American taxpayer. The bill before us authorizes $70 million over 5 years for R&D related activities, including the establishment of a new Department of Energy Research and Development Information Center. The importance of such a center to the bill's overarching goal to stabilize domestic supplies of rare earth materials is debatable. As a general rule, we should try to avoid statutory creation of such centers unless the need is clear and compelling. Centers are expensive, typically costing $5 million or more per year to implement. And once established, they have a tendency to exist in perpetuity. It's easier to kill a vampire than a new federal government program. In response to requests for stakeholders' comments on legislation, the U.S. Magnet Materials Association expressed concern about the creation of such a center, specifically stating, and I quote, "The U.S. MMA questions whether the center is an appropriate information clearinghouse," end quote. We've also heard concerns that this responsibility already exists at the USGS. The bill also includes specific language requiring the center to host annual conferences costing up to $375,000 to, quote, "promote information sharing and encourage new collaborative activities," end quote. With our growing debt, the justification for Congress to spend tax dollars on an information sharing conference is highly questionable. The American people want us to stop the unnecessary growth of government, and these concerns have prompted me to offer this amendment, and I ask for its support. Serve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. We will support the bill, or your amendment, but I would ask that you would work with us as we go to the floor if there's any fine-tuning on it to make sure that it doesn't go beyond your intention.
Happy to do that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Dalkemper is recognized.
In the interest of moving forward, I agree with accepting the amendment, but I did want to just make a few points that I think this amendment preserves a few of the proposed R&D Information Center functions and leaves behind really a greatly reduced information gathering function. And the R&D Information Center was intended to gather domestic and international scientific materials pertaining to rare earth materials in the same location and assist the stakeholders in actually using this information. There's also to be a location where researchers would gather to exchange information and ideas, whether at conferences or in the normal course of their work, and collaborate on projects. And I think centralizing the information and providing a locus for live information exchange on rare earth was intended to help resuscitate the U.S. research activity in the field of rare earths. But as I said, I'm glad to hear that the gentleman is willing to work on language, and I hope we can find some way to assure that this happens as we go forward. I yield back.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I support Mr. Olson's amendment to strike the Rare Earth R&D Information Center created in the bill for these reasons. The need for a center to conduct this activity is not as clear as it could be, especially since the U.S. Geological Service has responsibility for collecting similar data on research supply issues generally. Further, centers tend to be very expensive, as was pointed out by Mr. Olson, and they are difficult to terminate once they're created. Mr. Olson's amendment addresses this by eliminating this center and allowing DOE the discretion to support information sharing activities as necessary by determined, I guess, by the Geological Service. I urge its passage, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, Governor Garamendi is recognized.
Probably in this case, it would be Deputy Secretary Garamendi at the Department of Interior, where we oversaw the U.S. Geological Survey. The point of this bill is to focus America's attention and resources on the rare earth issue, which is of profound importance, as has been pointed out by the author. There's nothing in this bill that provides direction, support, money, or opportunity for the U.S. Geological Survey to further engage in this process and to play its role. As correctly stated a moment ago, the U.S. Geological Survey is the place in the federal government where the focus on these materials, or the geology and the materials, could be found. If we're going to strike this section for the reasons given, we really ought to provide some direction in the legislation to direct the USGS to get on with the task and to focus their attention to these rare earth issues. It's not in the bill presently. I'd ask the author to consider that as she moves the bill along for the purposes of providing directions to the U.S. Geological Survey to engage with the department and to carry out its role, and specifically on this function. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will quickly point out that we don't have jurisdiction in that area. That would be resources. However, Mr. Olson has agreed, and we always can count on him to fulfill that. We'll try to work through this to be sure that that we get the best bill possible. Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion, then all in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed? Say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. And now I ask unanimous consent to the chairman asks unanimous consent to clear up one of his many mistakes, and that is that I did not recognize the gentlelady from Illinois. Although I was told that you had wanted to be recognized, I have a short memory span, and it was right outside that. And so I ask unanimous consent that the gentlelady be able to submit a statement for the record on the last bill. Is there? Without objection, so ordered. The third amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 131, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hall, for considering my amendment. It amends Section 4 on page 5 in order to highlight the importance of collaborating and outreaching to historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. And this I'm not submitting as an affront. I'm doing this because we have such a lack of diversity in our national science enterprise. And although the majority of African Americans in college do not attend HBCUs, HBCUs graduate the majority of African Americans with doctorates in science, technology, engineering, and math. And these institutions have gotten it right for some reason. I'd like to see outreach to these universities. We should utilize every mind in this great nation and do what we can as legislators to encourage all Americans to enter these fields. In order for our country to maintain its leadership in innovation, we must identify and break down the barriers that are holding our country back from maintaining our diverse workforce. In 2010, we can no longer afford to ignore the glaring statistics showing women and minorities are being left behind in STEM disciplines. I will continue to address what I know is a serious problem. Working together, I believe we can achieve our common goal for diversity and equity in sciences. And so, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Hall, I appreciate your considering this straightforward, common-sense amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Johnson, thank you for this. This amendment simply clarifies that minority-serving institutions should be among those to be included in the DOE efforts to expand participation opportunities at universities under the bill. I support it, and I thank Ms. Johnson for offering it and her continued leadership on this particular issue. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and I concur that this is an excellent amendment. And if there's no further discussion on the amendment, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The fourth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Brown. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 316, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
The clerk, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I address my amendment, I just want to mention that while there may be appropriate pieces of this legislation that could help develop domestic research, as we desperately need, if this bill were to move forward, it also should be considered in the Natural Resources Committee, which has jurisdiction over the mining operations that would be eligible for loans under this bill, as the chairman just mentioned a minute ago. Secondly, I hope that the committee is in communication with Natural Resources and discussing legislation to assist the streamlining of mining permits and identification of public lands which are ripe for mineral developments. Further, this bill we are considering today also appears to be duplicative of the efforts currently being developed by the U.S. Geological Survey, underscoring the importance of including the Natural Resources Committee in any discussions impacting U.S. mining operations. Now back to my amendment. This amendment strikes Section 101A6, which requires the Secretary of DOE to, quote, coordinate activities of mutual interest and avoid duplication of effort, unquote, with the European Commission. While it makes sense to consult with allies on areas of mutual strategic interest, the underlying bill language is focused only on Europe and appears to go beyond traditional interactions. The term activities is undefined and therefore could include anything from trade policy to tax and regulatory issues. Further, why should we only coordinate with Europe? Most non-Chinese rare earth mining efforts are concentrated in Australia and Canada, two of our best allies. They certainly shouldn't be excluded from any international consultations. Striking this section will not permit the Secretary from seeking advice with any country or federal agency that the Secretary believes would be helpful in regarding rare earth mining, processing, production, or development issues. Lastly, avoiding duplication of effort should never be a foreign policy objective. The U.S. is, of course, a sovereign nation with our own interest. We should never avoid pursuing an activity out of concern for, quote, duplication of effort, unquote, with another country. I urge the committee to support this amendment to allow the Secretary the flexibility to discuss rare earth mining issues with any entity that the Secretary believes ought to be consulted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I encourage adoption of this amendment.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And let me concur in the sense that I agree with you. This amendment is too narrow. We should have further collaboration. I think it is to the benefit of all countries that aren't the monopoly here to get as much information on the table so that we can move forward. However, I will oppose this particular amendment because it would take out this particular collaboration, but would be happy to work with you as we go to the floor to expand it to additional countries and also to take out the mandatory aspect of it. Is there further discussion? So, Mr. Hall.
I want to offer my support for Dr. Brown's amendment. I think he raises some very important concerns with the bill's international collaboration requirement, particularly given that the ultimate goal of this bill is to address rare earth supply issues in the United States. Further, it's not clear why collaboration with the European Commission ought to be singled out over any other country or why avoiding, quote, duplication of effort, unquote, internationally is an appropriate goal. I thank Dr. Brown for offering the amendment. I urge its passage. I yield back, sir.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, then the vote's on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Brown. Well, first of all, Dr. Brown, the chairman is uncertain as to I assume you're asking for a recorded vote, and
That's
the chairman hasn't ruled yet, and I'm uncertain as to that vote. It was a light yes and a light no. So for that reason, you're recognized to, we'll call for a recorded vote, if that's what you would like.
Well, if we pass the amendment, I'm not going to ask for a recorded vote. So I'd like the chairman to rule, because I heard more ayes than noes. So.
Well, I guess when in doubt, then the amendment fails. So,
yes, Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is called for. Will the clerk will call the roll?
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Lipinski. No. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Rothman. No. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Hill. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. Mrs. Cosmas. Mr. Peters. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Hall. Aye. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Yeah. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Aye. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Aye. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson. Aye. Mr. Olson votes aye.
Did you say Bill Bray? Pardon? How is Mr. Bill Bray recorded?
Mr. Bill Bray is not recorded.
Is there anybody else that was missed? Does anyone wish to change, or Mr. Lujan is?
Mr. Lujan is not recorded. Mr. Lujan votes no.
Does anyone wish to change a vote? Ms. Johnson is recognized.
Ms. Johnson wants to change her vote from aye to no.
Mr. Wu is recognized.
Mr. Wu is not recorded. Mr. Wu votes no.
How is Ms. Woolsey recorded?
Ms. Woolsey is not recorded. No. Ms. Woolsey votes no.
Does anyone else wish to change a vote? Anyone else that has not voted? If not, then, oh, excuse me. How is Ms. Fudge
Ms. Fudge
recorded?
is not recorded. Ms. Fudge votes no.
And how is is Mr. Tonko been recorded?
Yes, Mr. Tonko voted no.
Okay. Is there anyone else then that wishes to be recorded? Seeing no one else, then the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 9 members vote aye and 14 members vote no.
The amendment is opposed, and the amendment fails. The fifth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Dr. Governor Garamendi. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Maybe we just ought to say Mr. Garamendi and forget all of the rest of it. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the discussion that we had in the previous amendment,
the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 033, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California and Mr. Roybacher of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading without objection. So ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
the discussion on the previous amendment highlights the necessity for, or the reality, actually, of international cooperation and agreements and discussions with regard to rare earth. Part of that discussion will undoubtedly take us to the conflict zones of the world, specifically Africa. I think the members of the committee are well aware of what are known as blood diamonds. The next blood diamond issue is already in existence, which is the rare earth issues. Often rare earth mining and extraction in Africa is, in fact, similar to the blood diamond issue, where it is used to fund conflicts and horrendous activities by warring parties. This amendment was intended to get to that issue because of the concerns that many members of the committee have about the underlying issue of conflict zones and, in this case, rare earth fueling those conflicts. We put forth this amendment. However, there are members of this committee and others that are concerned about the relationship of the United States to international law and other international treaties and organizations. So Mr. Rohrabacher and I, while we remain very concerned about the issue underlying, that is, of rare earth fueling conflicts, we don't want to get into a debate about the role of the United States with regard to international law and the like. I therefore yield to Mr. Rohrabacher on this issue, and I'm sure he'll express his concern on the underlying issue as well as concern on the international relations issues.
Thank you very much, and let me just thank my colleague for the cooperation that we've had on this. We both share some very deep concerns about some of the, what you might say, collateral damage of America's efforts to procure those resources that we need to maintain our standard of living in this country. And the gentleman is right on target and correct when he mentions and draws our attention to those incredible violations of human rights that are going on in Africa, in the procurement of a number of minerals. It's something that Americans should not in any way be furthering by our actions, both as consumers and as legislators here in the United States. Let me point out that we also have a problem, as the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, where we have this New York Times article, "In Dispute, China Blocks Rare Earth Exports to Japan," where you have the world's worst human rights abuser, China, threatening that the one shining light of democracy in Asia, Japan, threatening to do them great harm because they are now dependent, that Japan has this type of dependency as we do on China. We should not be dependent, especially dependent on countries that are utilizing their power in their country to suppress their own population. This amendment makes sure that at the very least, whether it's the communist Chinese or whether it's in Africa, that we do not procure rare earth minerals in a way that it undermines human rights standards throughout the world and our own human rights commitment here in the United States. The gentleman and I will be working on specific language. I am concerned about making sure that we do not subject American citizens to what I consider to be somewhat questionable authority, accumulations that we have in the name of international law. And just to be clear about that, to my colleague, the reason why I'm very concerned about saying international law is some of these very same countries that are human rights violators. If we set up a system of international law, the tribunals within decades could well be controlled by countries that are human rights abusers. And we don't need that. What we need to do is make sure that our own country maintains its standards. And I'll be working with the gentleman to come up with a specific language that will meet the objective of making sure that we are not procuring these rare earth minerals in a way that it undermines the respect for human rights and the standards that we hold dear. And so I would thank my colleague and join him, and we will be working out that language.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to raise this issue, and I thank my colleague from California in joining me. And I suspect the other members of the committee share the concerns that we have expressed. However, the amendment as written raises tangential issues that make it difficult for this specific language to proceed. I will therefore withdraw the amendment and work with the author and the committee and others to make it clear that in the acquisition of these rare earths that we do not violate or do not in any way create more havoc in very dangerous and unfortunate parts of the world. There are ways that can be done. We're working on some language. We simply don't have it together yet. I would also I'm sure the committee members are aware that there are international programs underway, many of them voluntary. In the United States and many of the American companies are participants in those programs to acquire these materials from those places where it does not create further conflict and acquire materials in a way that does not create further conflict. We'll work on it. It's an important issue to all of us, and therefore I withdraw the amendment.
Thank you, Governor. With unanimous consent, the amendment is withdrawn, and the sixth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Comrade Robacher, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 053, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Roy Bacher of California.
I issue unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
This amendment is, I guess, described as the fiscal responsibility amendment. We have to note that the Department of Energy has received billions of dollars more over the years from its baseline of 2007. And we did spend, our Congress now, we realize that the budget deficits are now running at a rate that it is becoming, dangerous for our society. I don't see how we can, and I don't know anyone who thinks that we can sustain the level of deficit spending at the rates that we're doing in the federal government. So when you face that challenge of bringing down this massive level of deficit spending in the federal government, at the same time recognizing that we have increased the budget by billions of dollars over the baseline of 2007 of the Department of Energy. Also, we realize that every research project, especially in the Department of Energy, should not be considered something that's ongoing no matter what. I mean, at some point, research projects should actually the doors should be closed and new projects should be looked at. So this is, I mean, after hopefully successful research, but even if it's unsuccessful, at some point, the line's got to be drawn and say, we've spent enough money on this. We've got to, in order to balance the budget or in order to spend money on other things, we've got to prioritize the spending and shut down certain areas and build up other areas. That's what this amendment does. It insists that we start prioritizing and that the people at the Department of Energy prioritize and that this then makes sure that this legislation does not add to the overall debt that our country is facing, and make sure that this is within the current budget levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. I will recommend that this amendment be accepted, not because this is not very important research that should be done, but I concur with you that I think there are existing resources within the department to carry this out. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I will point out that we're going to have about 5 amendments around quarter after. And so, but now we move on to the 9th Amendment on the roster. Or excuse me, Mr. Rohrabacher, do you have any additional amendments?
I will be withdrawing the next 2 amendments that I was planning to, based on the fact that they are no longer necessary due to the passage of the first amendment.
So we then will move to the 9th Amendment on the roster, which is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I am.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 314, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California and Mr. Garamendi of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment requires that loan guarantee recipients, when we're talking about this rare earth materials, people are receiving loan guarantees based on trying to find an answer to this challenge, that we make sure that that money is going to be used for the development of domestic processing capabilities in the United States, rather than to with the financing methods that will actually be used by foreign corporations and or by entities that are now processing materials that are coming from overseas. I mean, what are we trying to do here? Why are we concerned about these rare earth materials in the first place? Is because it makes us vulnerable. Well, why should we be providing loan guarantees that do not meet that problem, which is our vulnerability to other countries, if indeed we are not, if we are dependent upon them for these rare earth materials? So my amendment simply, and Mr. Garamendi has joined me in this, and we just insist that we use this to develop our own domestic capabilities within the United States, rather than spending our money and focusing it on things that will be used overseas. And I yield to my friend, Mr. Garamendi.
The continued, thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The continued collaboration between Mr. Rohrabacher and myself is going to lead to the destruction of both of our reputations. However, even in politics, the astronomy prevails, and occasionally the sun, the moon, and the earth line up, and you have an eclipse or an ellipse, as the case might be. In this case, policies are lining up. We're very concerned on our side about the American domestic production, manufacturing, and where it is headed. In this case, this amendment is very much in line with what we've been talking about, and that is make it in America. And therefore, I find this amendment to be appropriate and delighted to work with Mr. Roybacher on making it in America. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
This amendment would address a concern that's been raised by some of the competitors to Molycorp. That's a mining company that's pursuing a loan guarantee with the Department of Energy. Specifically, the concern is that raw materials could be mined and then sent over to China for processing, which would undermine the goal of the program to address U.S. supply concerns and in the process amount to a taxpayer subsidy of exports to China. This amendment would require DOE to ensure that recipients of loan guarantees under the program do not do this. It's a good amendment. I support it. Urge its passage. Yield back.
Dr. Baird is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I support the intent, but I want to make sure I understand the implications of it. So the intent I get. I think the premise is if we've got domestic supply needs, we want to make sure that the material is coming to our domestic consumers rather than getting exported.
Correct.
I get that. As I read it, though, help me understand something. It sounds like we may be saying in this amendment that it's not just about exporting the needed material per se, but exporting the technologies that are used to separate the material. In other words, let's suppose a U.S., and I may be reading it wrong, but let's suppose a U.S. manufacturer or engineer develops a technology for separating material, and they want to sell that technology to other countries. Are we saying they can't sell the technology? Is that an unintended? I may be reading it wrong.
That is not in the bill.
Okay.
I would suggest, Dr. Baird, that this may be one more area that we might need further collaboration as we move forward toward the floor.
Right.
Okay. I really want to look at that. I mean, I'm not going to oppose it at this point, but I want us to be very careful about that because I don't want to inadvertently penalize a U.S. manufacturer because it says, unless the project's proponent guarantees or provides to the Secretary an assurance that the loan or guarantee shall be used to support the separation, recovery, preparation, or manufacturing of rare earth materials in the United States for customers within the United States. If we export the technology to manufacture something, that's actually a net job gain to us. So anyway, I would urge you to work on that. I won't call for opposing it now, but I think we want to be very careful that we don't hamstring U.S. manufacturers or engineers for exporting the technology for separation if you're really trying to protect the material per se and adequacy here. And I'm not sure. At least we want to clarify that in some report language. So I'll yield back. But
I would just suggest that that the intent of this legislation is to make sure that what money is coming out of the U.S. taxpayers to provide loan guarantees, et cetera, are used for the benefit of the American people. That doesn't necessarily preclude that a company that receives this loan will also not be able to do other things.
If I may, I think the gentlemen may want to in some way clarify that the issue is making sure the adequate supply of the material, not necessarily to limit the export of the technologies that extract or purify the material. And maybe the gentlemen want to do that, but I'm not sure that's going to protect America.
Well, we would certainly be willing, and I can talk for myself, and I'm sure my colleague can speak for himself on this, but that would be acceptable in report language to clarify that.
I agree.
Thank you. Since we're all in agreement, then I assume there's no further discussion. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment, the 10th amendment on the roster, is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Dr. Brown, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We'll try again.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 315, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment ensures that the DOE loan guarantees to the rare earths industry do not interfere with or crowd out private sector activity. Specifically, it limits funding for rare earth projects to those categories that the private sector is not currently undertaking or likely to undertake due to excessive technical or financial uncertainty. Given recent reports describing the expected future increase in demand for rare earth mining and processing, China's export restrictions triggering rare earth price increases, and aggressive movement of private capital into rare earth operations, why are we looking to subsidize activities already being pursued in the private marketplace? For example, a recent rare earth investor newsletter describing the, quote, largest rare earth mine in the world discovered in Nebraska, unquote, stated that, quote, a source close to the venture capital community said that, I quote, capital would not be a problem, unquote. Similarly, Australian mine developer Linus recently raised $450 million to recover rare earth materials, and earlier stage exploration ventures are underway throughout Canada and the United States. On August 3rd, 2010, Molycorp, based in Greenwood, Colorado, raised $380 million through an initial public offering to support the reopening of its Mountain Pass, California rare earth mining operation. Its stock price has nearly doubled since the IPO, and its current market capitalization is now over $1.8 billion. The private, domestic, and international capital marketplace appears willing to invest in rare earth operations. Unless the Department of Defense asserts that it has a strategic need to ensure a stable supply of rare earth materials, taxpayers should not subsidize these private market activities. I urge the committee to support this amendment to prevent interference of taxpayer-funded subsidies with the private capital marketplace for rare earth operations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you for your consistency. Sincerely, I really think this is a different situation here. This is a national security issue. We're dealing with a monopoly. We saw what's already happened here. In terms of the private sector coming in, you know, that's hypothetical. Since you're dealing with a monopoly, they have the ability to, at a later date, flood the market with additional rare earth, bankrupt this private sector, and then jack them up again. This really is, I think, a national security issue. This is not a free market situation. We're dealing with again, with a virtual monopoly, and I think that we, for national security purposes, need to move forward and make available. Potentially, there could be more artfully drawn this, and we'll be happy to work with you. But the intent is there, and it's important.
Mr.
And
Chairman,
I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Well, I appreciate that. The purpose of this amendment is not to discourage our letting these contracts out, and not to discourage the research and development. The thing about it is that if the private sector is going to pursue this, why should we be expending federal taxpayer funds when the private sector is doing it? I certainly don't support the monopoly, and it's not. There has been a monopoly, and certainly I appreciate the importance of us making sure that China is not the only source of rare earths. But we have a big resource in Nebraska, Mr. Smith's state, and the thing is, why should we be just pouring money into the private and giving grants to the private sector when the marketplace right now will allow those private resources to come to play in the market, and we shouldn't be expending taxpayers' funds. So that's the reason for the amendment, and to the extent that a potential supply gap does raise national security concerns, that is a question for the Department of Defense and the Armed Services Committee to consider. And in fact, the Department of Defense is studying this issue, and the Armed Services Committee, the House and Senate, expect to hold hearings on this issue in the next couple of weeks. And so I encourage that this amendment is passed just to protect taxpayers' funds and not to expend it on companies that are going to expend the funds themselves through the private sector. I yield back.
Thank you. Once again, I will point out these are only guarantees, and again, only guarantees if necessary to bring the private sector in. If there's no further discussion, then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes appears to have it. The amendment is not successful. And
Mr. Chairman,
the 11th amendment. Dr. Brown, I respect you, and we'll do whatever you want. But we're going to have 5 votes.
I was just going to say I can count
votes.
very well, so I was not going to ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
You would have gotten it if you wanted it.
But thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm sure that's so. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. I guess so. You think my hearing is improving?
Mr. Chairman, enjoy it. We can count too.
The 11th and final amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. You are
Yes.
ready to proceed with your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 322, amendment to H.R. 6160, offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment moves the loan guarantee timeline up 3 years to be what was to be consistent with the 5-year authorization. As I understand, with the adoption of that amendment, there is no years on the authorization. But I think that for oversight, it's only sensible to sunset the loan guarantee program earlier than 8 years. It would have been to match the authorization. But with so many industries depending on these sensitive materials, we can't begin to understand what the domestic landscape for rare earth elements will look like in 2013, much less 2018. So with my amendment, we'll have the oversight ability to make adjustments in a timely fashion and with better understanding of the industry needs, since we were not able to discover those needs through the normal committee process. So I would urge approval of that, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Biggers. As usual, you add a sensible note to this discussion, and I would recommend that we accept your amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? If no, then the vote.
Mr. Chairman?
Um,
Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Baird is recognized.
I just can't resist saying that I just want to celebrate the passage of this law. For those of you who remember the group Rare Earth, that would make a lot of sense, but obviously no one else remembers the group Rare Earth.
But for those of you with a good sense of humor, it might not.
I think I was sitting behind Mr. Barrett at that concert. So.
All right. Once again, are there further amendments? If no, then the vote occurs on the bill. H.R. 6160 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. Or in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill passes, and I recognize myself, or rather, I recognize Ms. Dalkemper to offer a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this opportunity today to you and the ranking member. I think the current problem with rare earths is that we've had little attention to this for the last 20 years, and I'm glad that we are able to move ahead today. And I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 6160 as amended to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration.
The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to consider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views for the measure. And I want to thank you today for, I think we passed 2 very good national security, economic security bills. Let me also point out that I think a new indoor record was set in that we now, over the last 4 years, have passed 147 bills and resolutions from this committee in a bipartisan manner. So I thank you all for your cooperation. And I want to thank members for their attendance, and this concludes this markup.